Brookings Institution here in Washington. This is live coverage. You're watching C-SPAN.
I want to welcome you to this educational policy discussion, which is based on the issues raised in the new book by Diane Ravitch, Left Behind: A Century of Failed School Reforms. Certainly education is a timely issue. It's a major issue in the presidential campaign. It normally shows up as number one on the list of concerns in polls of voters. And of course, we're just now in the first weeks of school. And this event is an opportunity to reflect on education reform, what's worked and what hasn't worked, what's gone right, what's gone wrong, and to discuss how we can fix it. I want to offer a special welcome, incidentally, to our C-SPAN viewers. Diane Ravitch argues in her new book that efforts to improve America's schools have been foiled by reformers who sought to do away with a traditional curriculum, instead using schools as vehicles for social reform. And by doing so, she writes, they have ignored the real purpose of American education, which is to educate every child. The format for this afternoon's discussion will be that first we're going to hear from Secretary Donna Shalala of the Department of Health and Human Services, then from William Bennett, former Secretary of Education, now co-director of Empower America, and finally from the author Diane Ravitch, who is a senior fellow here at Brookings, the Brown Chair in Education Studies at Brookings, and a research professor at New York University, and a former Assistant Secretary of the Department of Education. In case you didn't get your packets, there are plenty outside at the desk, which will give you bios, complete bios of all of our speakers and background on this issue. Unfortunately, we don't have free books for everybody. The publisher decided to send enough books for the press, but the books are available at any bookstore or online bookstore. I also want to remind you that more information on this topic is available on the Brookings website. There will be a complete transcript of this event along with a video of this event on the Brookings website at www.brookings.edu. And after this afternoon's discussion, there will be a reception on the second floor in the Stein Room. There will be ample opportunity for you to take part in the discussion and to ask your questions. So let me introduce our three speakers and then get out of the way so you can hear some opening comments from them and then join in the discussion. As I said, Donna Shalala is Secretary of Health and Human Services. She has served in that position longer than any other person in history. It's a large department of 61,000 employees and a $387 billion budget. Previously, she was Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and she was named during her tenure there by Business Week as one of the 5 best managers in higher education. Bill Bennett has been a cabinet member, as I say, Secretary of Education, also chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, both under President Reagan and in the President Bush's administration, he was drug czar. He has also written or edited 14 books. 2 of his most recent and most popular were the Book of Virtues and the Children's Book of Virtues. He works closely with Senator Joe Lieberman, the Democratic vice presidential candidate.
That's the way it goes.
On the fight against the decline of popular culture and the end of worldwide religious persecution. He is also co-chairman of the Partnership for Drug-Free America, along with Mario Cuomo. And finally, Diane Ravitch, as I said, holds the Brown Chair in Education Policy here at Brookings, where she's a senior fellow. She edits the Brookings papers on education policy, and she is a research professor at NYU. She's a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, a position she was appointed to by Education Secretary Riley, and she was an Assistant Secretary of Education responsible for the Office of Educational Research and Improvement. She is the author of 7 books, her most recent and the focus of today's discussion, Left Back: a Century of Failed School Reforms. So we'll begin what should be a lively and interesting discussion with Secretary Shalala.
Thanks very much, Ron. I think I stayed at HHS long enough to see whether they'd send education back to me, and it'd be HEW. I've been waiting, and I'm still waiting. Let me start by answering the question of what's the Secretary of Health and Human Services doing here talking about a book about education. Well, the fact is that I started out as a person in education, as Diane well knows. As a matter of fact, I first met Diane Ravitch in her own apartment in the very early 70s, in which she invited me over to dinner to meet Al Shanker. A very long time ago. So Diane and I have known each other for a long time. We overlapped at Teachers College in the 1970s, in which she was a very distinguished student of Lawrence Kremen, the great historian of American education. I was a little assistant and then associate professor teaching the politics of education at Teachers College. And one day in the 70s, Lawrence Kremen, we all used to shake when he came to our office, came to see me, and he said he needed me to do something with him, and I said, what is it? Columbia had a tradition in which the chair of a dissertation defense had to be from outside the discipline of the person that was defending, and he explained to me this was a very unusual dissertation defense. The first time in the history of Teachers College that there would be a PhD defense in which the individual would defend a book that they had actually written before they had completed their coursework. And the individual was Diane Ravitch, who was going to defend the Great School Wars, which of course itself, when it first came out, was somewhat controversial. And Larry said that he needed a friend to chair the dissertation defense, and would I please chair the doctoral defense, and I agreed to do that. 5 minutes into the dissertation defense, before we invited Diane, she's never heard the story, before we invited Diane to come in, 3 members of the committee said that they weren't sure that she could possibly defend this book because it had a point of view, and it didn't seem to them to be a very scholarly book because it did come to conclusions and have a very strong point of view. And Larry was, of course, crestfallen. One of the few times that he was without proper words, and quick on my feet, which I'm sure got me this job that I'm currently in. I said that the issue was not whether the book had a point of view, but whether the scholar could come in and critique her own book, which Diane proceeded to do brilliantly. Probably the finest dissertation defense I've ever participated with. She took her book apart and put it back together again, and people asked her very tough questions about a book that she had already completed. And she actually, in many ways, reconceptualized the book in front of a very critical group of scholars, and of course went on to a very distinguished career as an educational historian. Let me also say that when I read the book, I called Diane and said it was her best book yet. Because what Diane has done in this book, and I think what many of us have been waiting for, is for a historian, and unusual among historians. Most historians today take a narrow piece of history and give us a narrow look. And the long tradition of historians being willing to look at the sweep of history and give us a big look at a big subject, very few scholars are willing to do that, feel comfortable enough to do that. And Diane's contribution in this book is to look at the history of American education, the most part in the 20th century, to apply a rigorous eye of someone who not only studies education, but actually knows a great deal about what goes on in classroom and in schools, who talks constantly to people that do schooling in our country. And to take a very rigorous look at some of the chances we actually took in education, with particularly the leaders that pushed us in certain directions. And of course, she comes to conclusions which many of us would agree with now, though we play with these conclusions somewhat. The schools cannot be expected to solve all of society's problems. My own department constantly is asking the schools to do more, to sign kids up for education. Is one thing, but to sign them up for health care is another assignment. To take responsibility for making sure that that youngsters not only have sound minds but have sound bodies is in fact an increasing responsibility that we've laid on schools, because we have no other easy ways to get access to kids except in a schooling setting. We've asked schools to integrate mental health practices into the educational curriculum. We've asked teachers to learn more than just the content of what they're trying to learn, but to learn more about child development and more about some fundamental health issues that kids may or may not have that would have impact. And we've asked people to spend a lot of time doing these things, let alone if you sweep through the cabinet-level departments in this town, each one of them has asked the schools to do something. The Agriculture Department has asked them to give school breakfasts and school lunches and to pay attention to the nutrition of the schools. So it's not simply society in general asking the schools to solve a number of problems. It's asking the schools to do more inside that building that the teachers and the administrators are not necessarily trained for, but it's because it's one of the few institutions where we can get the attention of people between a certain age for a certain period of time. So we all have taken on those requirements. Second, I think that Diane makes a very clear point about the quality of education and not lowering the quality or fooling around with alternatives and tracking students and expecting young people to be able to decide that they want to go into a certain track. I am a graduate of the Cleveland Public School System, and I actually finished high school at a technical high school in which the vast majority of the kids that I went to high school with did not go on to college. And many of them, as I read reports of what they're doing now, have had trouble adjusting to this new economy because they got a narrower view of what their opportunities were and they didn't go on and get some additional education. But it wasn't just that they didn't go on and get some additional education. It's that they were not prepared to absorb these new technologies or new ideas or new philosophies as part of their education. And so as the world changed in front of them, they didn't have the kind of sound education they needed to adjust as the world adjusted. And my closest friends in high school were not in the very small number of us that were in college prep, but were in a wide variety of technical subjects in which they initially got jobs, but then as the economy changed in our community, their opportunities changed at the same time. And third, Diane says that that schools that emphasize immediate experiences and ignore the transmission of knowledge. And there, I think that Diane, in another publication or another article, has made a very important point that I have always remembered when it came to young people and education. And that is that we're not fair or honest with American kids about how hard learning is. That we've been so anxious to code it in a way so it's easier to go down that we forget that it takes a certain number of repetitions to learn a skill, in the same way that learning really is hard work and takes a certain amount of hard work, a lot of hard work, to thoroughly learn the kinds of things that we think young people need to learn, particularly the skill development of mind so that they can absorb the changes that are happening. And we're not really straight out with them. In many ways, we get more honest as they get to universities, where we expect them to catch up, and we work them a little harder than we do in elementary and secondary school. And I've always remembered that, because you don't see that on the playing fields. What goes on in the classroom in America's schools is different than what goes on on the playing fields where coaches are actually trying to get winning teams and develop skills, in which they're perfectly willing to insist on repetition after repetition with small corrections until students get it perfectly. And I've always thought that whether it's in higher education or in schools, we could learn something from the coaches about perfecting learning in a way that it takes a certain amount of repetitions, but it also takes those small corrections along the way so you actually build on knowledge. And it's a very different way of thinking about knowledge, but it takes hard work. And anyone that wants to be a champion, whether it's on the playing fields or in the classroom, it takes hard work, and American education has not been willing to confront the fact that learning takes hard work. And my hope is that both out of Diane's work and maybe with some of the rigor that will come out of the future discussions in terms of policy and education, we will get some of that. So let me congratulate my good friend Diane Ravitch. She is not only a first-rate historian, but a very good friend. And I'm very happy to be here for her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ron Nesson. Thank you, Brookings Institution. Very glad to be here again. I won't be long, or at least my remarks won't be as long as it may seem to some of you. I first heard about Diane Ravitch from the distinguished psychologist Joseph Adelson, one of your friends and admirers from way back. And I said, "Why do you like her so much?" He said, "Well, because she knows everything about education." I was willing to take Adelson's word, but it was confirmed later when I became Secretary of Education, and I hired my Assistant Secretary of Education, Chester Finn, who I see is here today, who I thought knew everything about education, at least would offer an opinion about everything. And usually well informed. And then one day I went down to see him, and his door was closed, and the secretary said I couldn't go in. And I said, "Well, I'm the secretary. I'm just going to knock and see." Poked my head in and found out he was talking to somebody who he believed too knew everything. So find out the person that the person you think knows everything talks to find out, and that was Diane Ravitch. So I don't know if there's someone Diane turns to, but. Check the footnotes. It would usually be in there. I want to. Donna's right about the coaches, and happily, with the loss of history and the ahistorical sense that's out there, you can rediscover all sorts of things. I remember about 15 years ago discovering an article in a psychology magazine with tremendous enthusiasm talking about something called the Wooden method, and the Wooden method was a method for teaching math based on the coaching of John Wooden. And it suggested that the teacher go to the chalkboard, as Wooden does, show the students how the problem worked, find a solution to it with the students, and have the students drill. This breakthrough in the teaching of mathematics was actually called that, a breakthrough. So we reinvent the wheel from time and time again. There's a lot to learn from coaches, and they, like the American public in Diane's book, are more resistant to a lot of trends that are harmful, so there's some things to learn. I want to just make a few comments from the book, which I enjoyed enormously, especially reviewing my notes just before I came today, because I started the day and spent most of the day reacting to this Federal Trade Commission report about movies and video games and music. And it's nice to end the day with a book, or at least a good book, that we don't have to send to the FTC for worries about whether it'll be corrupting the youth of Athens or any place else. A few things about the book. I want to comment. Diane said I could say whatever I wanted to say. I'll do that, but I'll at least show the courtesy of giving a page reference where I want to say something back to the book. But I also want to use this occasion to ask Diane some questions to get the conversation going, because like the administrators who she talks about on page 239, school officials surely wanted to be up to date and modern. I recall the aphorism of a German philosopher who, failing to make any kind of argument at all in defense of his position, said, "Well, at least I'm a contemporary." And Thank you. This was the position of a lot of people you were talking about. And school officials, not at the times Diane's writing about, not sure of what arguments to make, at least wanted to be up to date. It's very important to be up to date. It was very important in the 40s, 30s, and 40s to be up to date, and it's very important now to be up to date. Now, that doesn't necessarily go against the historical sense, though it doesn't obviously underscore it, but I want to be up to date and ask Diane, because this is too good a resource, too good a mind. We should press her, I think, on some of the contemporary issues. You bring us up to a lot of contemporary stuff, to Hirsch and to self-esteem movements and other things. But what about the implications of your book for something like school choice? What about the implications of your argument for something like homeschooling, particularly where the public, the parents, seem to be kind of the innocent and right victims here throughout the story. They seem to want the right stuff throughout the story you recount. Should we give them more opportunity? If the professionals are getting it wrong a lot of the time, and if the school officials, many of them still want to be up to date, but parents' basic instinct is right, should we give them, Diane, more opportunities? And I think it was you who pointed out a very important quote from John Stuart Mill. Maybe you still have that handy about parents and government. Okay, on page 13, Diane, you say that never has there been a period in which people were satisfied with the schools. That's right, but then you go from there to say there was no golden age. I don't think one follows from the other, and I wanted to ask you, just because people weren't satisfied, that doesn't mean some periods weren't better than others. And it seems to me, in the book, you suggest that one point, you talk about the Philadelphia schools, pre-1930, at least in regard to reading the classics and the study of the humanities, were a pretty good model. 1963 is often talked about as a high water mark for mathematics. There may not have been golden ages, but there were some peaks and some valleys. Could you tell us what some of them were and why they were, why sometimes were better than others? A few other comments and just my comment on them. It's a quote from the book. Nothing could persuade the progressives to alter their views. Nothing. That's an interesting kind of statement. That is, there was no evidence. Hannah Arendt wrote once that there is no insulation of the mind more complete than that of ideology. And these were ideologues of a very deep and sustained type. And there was nothing, no empirical evidence that could alter their views. An old version of a kind of political correctness. The public is, it seems to me throughout the book, tell me if I'm wrong, more sensible in asking for a good education. They said, why are you getting rid of the great books? All the pedagogues hated the great books, but parents wanted it. You tell us in one place that minority parents particularly wanted the great books, the good stuff. I'm reminded one of your heroes in this book, certainly an educational hero, and anybody who cares about content of the curriculum, Al Shanker. Remember Shanker's great story when he talks about going into the classroom with the slow learners and asks the kids, what do you want to learn? And the kid raised his hand and says, we want to read what the smart kids read. It just might take us a little longer to get through it. Anyway, I found that very interesting. It looked to me as if this whole 280 pages, not 280 pages, but the history you recount in 280 or 300 pages, essentially was, although it wasn't intended as this, came out as a kind of a plan to insulate the lower classes from upward mobility. I mean, you had the elite, if I gather correctly, in the Lincoln School and the other school. But for the kids who are trying to succeed and make it up in American society, this plan of the progressives would essentially keep them in their place. And that's one of the worst aspects of this plan. Page 272, poor black parents consistently favor traditional education for their children. I don't think one has to point out to this audience that, you know, if there's a place where a bad educational practice is likely to, or a bad educational idea is likely to be put into practice, it'll be in our schools, it'll likely be in our inner city schools, it'll likely to be an experiment on the kids who need experiments the least and need tried and proven education the most. Well, again, it's just, you know, somebody said life is one thing after another and was corrected by someone to say it's one dumb thing after another. This story is just one bad idea by one intellectual after another, and it's just depressing that so many intellectuals, I don't mean it. I don't mean with that gesture. How could so many brilliant people be so wrong, you know? How could all these PhDs be so wrong? How could all these people with dissertations be so dumb and blind to the consequences of what they were doing? And talking to each other and not looking at the evidence. I mean, it does bring to mind the emperor's new clothes. And Diane stands up here and says, you know, these guys don't have any clothes. This stuff is wrong. There were some brave people, as you point out. Candell, or is it Candle? Candell, Isaac Candle, and Bagley, and other heroes. But they were drowned out. And one of the ways they were drowned out I found very interesting. Of course, they feared loss of tenure. They feared, reprisals. But as Diane points out, most of them feared being called conservative. That was really the kind of ultimate weapon. Still is in lots of places. And they would simply, if they persisted, people would use the ultimate weapon and call them a conservative, and that would be it for their reputation. And I don't know where they would go after that. Government, I guess, or some other kind of think tank. But in any case, there were some people brave enough to withstand not only career pressure, but being name-calling and made the criticism. I'll pass in the interest of time, but page 241, the subjects in the Virginia schools, I found that fascinating because Virginia is now, trying to redo its curriculum, and much more promising, I think, what's going on there now than what you recount on page 241. Well, just very briefly, how's this for a curriculum? This was the stuff that parents didn't understand. The curriculum was based on the major functions of social life and included the following as subjects: protection and conservation of life, property, and natural resources, production of goods and services, and distribution of the returns of production, consumption of goods and services, expression of aesthetic impulses, and expression of religious impulses. These were the courses of study. That was the principles of intellectual organization. Pretty discouraging. But again, there are some heroes: Bagley, Candell, and others. Just a couple more points, and I'll stop. I found it fascinating, and this I had never heard before. There's a lot in this book I didn't know, a lot I hadn't heard before, but I did not know, and this was I thought, a very charming thing to bring out, and very encouraging, that resistance to a lot of the worst ideas that were coming from the progressives at the universities were from teachers. Teachers who had been in the field and had been teaching, and they said, no, don't, stop. We won't let you do that. We want to teach our students these subjects. And of course they were made fun of by the university professors who said they just didn't grasp what was going on. But if I read this right, a major line of resistance was from the teaching corps itself. Good for them. Two last points. There were a lot of, this was, I must say, nostalgia and somewhat deja vu for me. Names I had sort of lost since the drug war will make you forget a lot, But names I hadn't thought of in a long time. But you cite one of my heroes, a man I met only once, who I agree with you would have made a great difference if he was still around, Ron Edmonds, and the effect of schools literature, which I think is still pretty good research. Tremendous figure who died way before his time. And then the final point, which is made throughout this book, and I think needs to be taken to heart by anyone interested in reform, which is the effort to diminish schools' intellectual purpose. Hurts everyone, but it hurts the poor. It hurts those who have the most to gain from education the most. It's a very interesting and important piece of work, and please write a follow-up on the 90s. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I first of all want to thank both Donna Shalala and Bill Bennett and tell you a story about each of them. Donna didn't tell you that she invited me one year to go join her on her annual adventure trip, and I went with her to the Himalayas. And there was one morning when my hair got really rank, and she gave me a shampoo in the Himalayas, and she said, "Someday you can use this story." So I would like to declare here publicly that I was given a shampoo by Secretary Shalala in the Himalayas. She's just a wonderful person, as you know, from having been exposed to her over these last almost 8 years in Washington, as well as her prior public service. Bill Bennett has been a great champion, and I wanted to tell you a little story about Bill. Bill was at the National Humanities Center back in the 1970s, and he came to see me. Here I was, a lowly professor at Teachers College, and he said, "You know, I'm dying in North Carolina. I really would love to get a job teaching, and I wonder if you could recommend me to the faculty at Teachers College." And I did recommend him, and they wouldn't interview him. They wouldn't even interview him, and I guess it's because he didn't have the right education credentials, hadn't taken the education courses, whatever. And I've often wondered what would have happened to American education if Bill Bennett had gone to Teachers College instead of the NEH. I don't know, but it could have been different. I do want to thank Donna for her comments and say that I appreciate her pointing out the important roles that schools do play in addition to intellectual development. And she understands, as I think anyone would understand, that I am not arguing that schools should ignore the medical and health needs of children and the nutritional needs of children, but that they must take care of their brains and their intellectual development and give every child an equal chance intellectually at the same time that they are taking care of those other needs. And this is a very important responsibility. And it occurred to me as I was listening to her a quote that I happen to love in the book. It's from W.B. Du Bois, and he was speaking to a group of black school teachers in 1935 at a time when the whole education world was very excited by the idea, dare the schools build a new social order? Can the schools be the leading edge of social change? And Du Bois said to them there was only one way for the schools to cure society's ills, and that was by making people more intelligent. And he said the school has again but one way, and I'm quoting from him, and that is first and last to teach them to read, write, and count. And if the school fails to do that and tries beyond that to do something for which a school is not adapted, it not only fails in its own function, but it fails in all other attempted functions, because no school as such can organize industry or settle a matter of wage and income, can found homes or furnish parents, can establish justice or make a civilized world. Clearly, Du Bois wanted all of these latter things to happen, but he said the schools have job number one. Of course they have to do job number one, and then they can do all the other things as well, but job number one first. I was also reminded, listening to Donna, since she pointed out that she grew up in Cleveland, of a quote in the book from the superintendent of schools in Cleveland. And the book basically tells a narrative, and the narrative goes like this, that at the beginning of the 20th century there was a clearly established democratic ideal. The ideal was referred to at the time by the simile of the educational ladder, that every child, for as long as he or she stayed in school, should have access to a high-quality education, one which included history and literature, math and science, and certainly a foreign language. And as it happened, most parents, for some reason, wanted their children to study Latin. The reason they wanted them to study Latin was that Latin was considered the language of culture and high literacy. And immigrant parents and poor parents and black parents wanted their children to study Latin. So at the beginning of the century, that small minority of kids who actually made it to high school, most of them would study Latin, a few studied Greek, but every child studied a foreign language. And then the movement grew. It was modernism, and it was a revolt against tradition. It was part of being the avant-garde, which was very trendy and exciting. But the movement grew amongst educational leaders to say this is not socially efficient. Schools should serve society, and the way they should serve society is to create job preparation programs, vocational education, industrial education, begin as early as possible, preferably around the age of 12, directing young children for their job preparation. And so it became the thing to do. And the story I tell is of one school district after another adopting what they called a differentiated curriculum. What used to be called the common curriculum was then relabeled the college preparatory curriculum. And instead of having all children rising up the educational ladder as far as they could go, the ladder went in different directions, with a very small number going towards the college prep curriculum, even though they probably weren't going to go to college. And most kids pushed forward into vocational or industrial education. Now, I come back to Cleveland to say that the superintendent of schools there insisted that the differentiation should begin as early as elementary school, and the earlier tradition, the 19th century tradition, was that the first 8 grades were a common curriculum. After that, you went your own way. And so the superintendent of Cleveland said that the elementary curriculum had to be reorganized because he said the social order needs lawyers, doctors, preachers, teachers, men of science, etc., but they will only be 4% of the breadwinners, and another 1% would be needed, or they will only be 1%, and another 4% would do all the professional work of society. The 95% must be trained for industry and commerce, and the program of the public school should reflect their occupations. Now, the question arises, and this I find again and again and again and documented extensively, how would the schools know which children were likely to go to college as early as 4th or 5th grade and which would work in industry? And so the superintendent of Cleveland writes, "It is obvious that the educational needs of the child in a district where the streets are well paved and clean, where the homes are spacious and surrounded by lawns and trees, where the language of the child's playfellows is pure, and where life in general is permeated with the spirit and ideals of America, it is obvious that the educational needs of such a child are radically different from those of the child who lives in a foreign and tenement section." That's how you determine who would get into the college-bound track and who are the other 95% of the kids. So this story repeats itself in city after city, and the movements come very thick and fast after this. And this is the story of my book, is all of these movements. And the movements are, and I won't even list them, I have like at least 20 different movements. It's the industrial education movement, the social efficiency movement, the junior high school movement. The reason the junior high schools were created was to start the tracking not in 9th grade but in 6th or 7th grade. The IQ testing movement becomes very powerful when added to this initial impulse, because the IQ test, which was developed for group use during World War I, then becomes the mechanism that allows educators en masse to track kids and to predict as early as 1st or 2nd or 3rd grade, these are the children that we should give the good stuff to, and these are the children who are going to go into the profession, or not into the professions, into the occupations, into industry. And so the sorting becomes very early, and it's the IQ testing which spreads like wildfire that makes this kind of differentiation possible, and also makes it seem to be the essence of science. Every school district has to use IQ testing because it's scientific. And we even get something called the school survey movement, where all the experts from the universities come to local communities and they say the trouble with this community is you're not using enough IQ testing, you're not dividing the kids up early enough, you're not sending them off for industrial education at a young enough age, and you get this kind of report going on in city after city. And then comes other movements, the child-centered movement. And the child-centered movement essentially says, it's not about the traditional curriculum. Education is not about the traditional curriculum. That's very old-fashioned, and we don't want to do anything old-fashioned. We want children to be interested and have fun, and so having fun becomes very important. Well, that had more of an impact in the private schools than in the public schools, but I document, story after story where this becomes very important in the differentiation that most of us grew up with. Now, as it happens, most of us were placed in the college track. I was in the college track. I went to public schools in Texas, so I thought everything was fine. Most educated people were in the college track, so we didn't notice that most of the kids that we were going to school with were not in the college track. And I conclude, after going through some 18, 19, or 20 or more movements, my conclusion is that educational movements should be avoided like the plague. That it's this very idea that education needs a movement to reorder all of its priorities every few years that is itself a problem. We need to focus on teaching and learning. And again, as Donna said, my point was not to say ignore all of the other social needs of children. Of course you shouldn't ignore them. But at the heart of school is the teacher and the child, and the focus on teaching and learning. I've often asked myself, why would I want to go to a doctor who was always using the latest, most experimental method? I don't. I want to go to a doctor who knows what to do when I come in and says, this has been tested on thousands of other people. We know that it will work in 99% of the cases. And if he wants to use an experimental method, he sure better get my permission before he does it. But we are constantly introducing innovation after innovation, and somehow the hallmark of education in this country, at least for the last 50 or more years, has been, is it innovative? Well, why don't we think about, does it work? Is it effective? Do children learn because you're doing this? And so the three errors, as I call them, that I pointed out were, first of all, this idea that education should be a form of social engineering. I do think that education is a very important way to reform society, but it has to happen one child at a time. It's as if with your own children, you look at your children and you say, I can love each of them one child at a time, but I can't make policy statements about my children. They're my children. And I think we have to begin to look at all children as if they were our children and not categorize children and say, these are the important ones and those are the unimportant ones. These are the ones that are bound for college. Those are the ones that we're not going to worry about because they don't come from the homes with well-tended lawns. The second error, which is related to the first, is this notion that we can divide education up, that we can give a high-quality education to some children and not to at least attempt to have a high-quality education for all children. And third is the point that I think Bill mentioned this, as did Donna, and that is the idea that schools are not responsible for transmitting knowledge, that knowledge has become something that everyone can pick up on the internet or by looking it up on the encyclopedia, and that's wrong. Schools have a very important mission in teaching children about the important discoveries that have been made in mathematics and in science, about giving children the opportunity to study the great works of literature from many different cultures, about giving children the opportunity to learn history and to have, as citizens, the ability to think and reflect, to listen to what candidates have to say, and to make their own decisions based on knowledge rather than on who has the most effective soundbite. I do think that what the schools do best is two things. One, teaching children and transmitting knowledge, being a very important part of teaching children, and also teaching character. And I did throughout the book stress that character stands co-equal with knowledge and intelligence. You can't have knowledge disembodied from character. You end up with all sorts of evils and distortions as we have learned to our woe in the 20th century. Bill posed to me the hard question about what about now? Now, I've had the experience in the last couple of weeks of going on talk shows, and no one's actually read the book out there, so people call in and they say, what about homeschooling and what about choice? And they raise the kinds of questions that he was raising. And I have to say that the book that I've written is not a policy book. It doesn't tell people what to do tomorrow. What I've tried to do is to describe the intellectual traditions that we have inherited, also to describe what I see as some very positive things that have been happening in the last 20 years with the real, I think, important realization that we do have to educate all children. I think we hear this mantra all the time of all children can learn, and some people think it's just empty verbiage. I don't think it's empty verbiage, and if you look at the history, if you look at the last 100 years, and if you see how many times people made statements about which children can learn and which children can't be expected to learn, then it represents a huge and important change that now we have educators and parents standing up and saying all children should be expected to learn. This is an important change. We should recognize it as such. And I can tell you that in the end of the book there's some brief discussion of those people whose voices are very loud who say, well, if we educate all children that way, or if we try to, who'll take out our garbage? I submit to you that's not the role of the school. We don't have to train people to take out the garbage. I'm afraid that in this history that I've laid out, as I hope you'll have the opportunity to see, there was too much of that kind of thinking of let's educate some to be the elite and some to be the worker bees and others to take out the garbage. I don't think that's why we have public schools. You know, when people call in and they say, well, what do you think about homeschooling? I say, I could never do it. I mean, I'm a fairly well-educated parent, and I never attempted to educate my own children at home, so my hats are off to those parents who can do it well. I haven't seen the evidence about how well homeschooling is working. I know that some of the homeschool children do extraordinarily well. There have been a lot of reports about kids who win the National Spelling Bee or the National Geography Bee. I don't know whether they represent the, one end of the spectrum, and I don't know what's happening to the broad range of them, and I certainly would like to know. But my hats are off to those mothers and fathers who are willing to take this burden on, and I wish them well, because it's an important and difficult job. I want to echo what Donna said, that part of the story that I've tried to tell is that there has been this constant search for the magic feather. What magic thing can we do so that it won't be hard to teach and learn? And we've never found the easy way. I remember when I was a kid, there used to be ads in magazines about sleep learning. And you could put the record on and go to sleep, and during the night, the information would somehow get into your brain while you were sleeping. That didn't work. Easy ways don't work. Teaching and learning is difficult, as every good teacher will tell you, and it does require effort. And I think that one of the lessons of this history is the point that Harold Stevenson at the University of Michigan made in his book, The Learning Gap, and that is that we have been too inclined in our country to think that what counts is not effort but ability. And I think this goes back to our many decades of reliance on IQ testing, this notion that either you've got it or you don't. And I don't have it for math, so therefore I'm not going to study math. But I've heard many a parent tell me, my daughter really isn't good at math, but she had to take the test, and she learned it, and she passed the test, and she found out she is good at math, and this was something new. So I don't think that, everyone's not going to be good at everything, but if you work hard, you can learn it. And there is nothing that schools are doing now in the way of the curriculum that is beyond the reach of virtually any child. One more point, and that is Bill mentioned some of my heroes, which are unknown to virtually everybody because they were anti-progressive, and progressive's a good word, anti-progressive's a bad word. William Chandler Bagley, Isaac Kandel, William Torrey Harris. The irony is they were all bona fide, certified political liberals. They believed in public education. They believed in universal education. They believed that all children can learn. They were against IQ testing. They were the good guys, and they got knocked because they were against this notion of differentiating the curriculum and saving the good stuff for the elite. And they got a bad deal because guess what? My book's the only history where you'll ever read about the fight that they put up against many of these trends which consign lots of people to a very inferior education. So with that, I want to thank my friends. I thank you all for being here and open up the discussion to the audience.
I'll get my book back.
Everybody got their mic clipped on? Let me ask a couple of questions just to get the discussion going. Let me try and get an answer to one of Bill's questions. Diane, he said that he thought that your book, summarizing modern education reform, amounted to the message that it all was aimed at insulating the lower classes from advancing. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I don't think that anyone who was... It had that effect. I don't think there was the intention of preventing the lower classes from rising, and I think you'll find many people who will say, my parents were poor, and I got a really good education, so I don't know what you're talking about. But if you look at the overall differentiation movement, there were, let's say in the 1950s, something called the life adjustment movement. The explicit argument made by people who were advocating the life adjustment movement, and even from the U.S. Department of Education at that time, was 20% of the kids are capable of preparing for college, 20% are capable of preparing for good jobs, and the other 60% have to be basically warehoused until they get out of high school because there are no jobs for them, and they just should be given whatever minimal training you give to not very bright people. So I think that while the intention may not have been to keep that 60% dumb, they were written off to begin with.
Madam Secretary, both you and Bill Bennett mentioned that coaches seem to work children harder, to demand more of them, to demand greater performance and perfection. Why is that? And should teachers act more like coaches?
Well, I think I was making the point about skill development, not about intellectual development necessarily, though increasingly, if you ever looked at a coach trying to explain a complicated strategy in a football game, it does require a lot of intelligence to follow that plan. I think I was making the point about education being hard work and the need for a certain amount of repetition in education. Now, I don't mean rote learning. there's a difference between rote learning and constantly making the kind of corrections so you're actually acquiring knowledge. I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in Iran, and here's my memory of education in Iran. Kids standing under streetlights memorizing, and memorizing, and memorizing. So I'm not talking about rote learning, but coaches aren't limited by semester plans in terms of learning a certain amount. They get the repetitions going, they make the little corrections until they get the level of performance they're looking for. And yeah, we can learn some things from about coaches. Coaches also have, the best ones have easy relationships with the students. And when we're talking about moral development and passing on messages about good behavior, they're less formal about that, and they can be just as effective. But it doesn't translate as easily over to the classroom. But there is a certain amount that you can translate over into the classroom. But I think the point about hard work is the point that I wanted to make. That it's the going over and over the material in a variety of different ways, but it's also working with the material so that you can use it seamlessly and easily. People ask me in tennis what I think about when I'm on the tennis court. The fact is nothing. I play my best tennis when there's nothing in my head because it's become so automatic for me. And in some ways, once you've absorbed education and you're learning new things, it can be as seamless. If you're well-trained and well-educated. People ask me, how did you learn healthcare so fast? Fact is that I was so well-trained in other subjects that learning a new subject was relatively easy. It was like learning a new language.
Before going to the audience, let me ask you all one last question about the discussion going on in the presidential campaign about education issues. What is the role of the federal government to improve education in a system that is really based on local control? Bill?
Let me comment on the first two, since I was reading in those. I didn't say it. If I did, I misspoke, that the intention was to insulate the lower classes from upper middle. That was certainly the effect. All these movements have good intentions. Everybody's got good intentions. Virtually every movement starts out saying it wants to help. Cause of social efficiency, people in those neighborhoods will be happier doing that kind of work than intellectual work. It's all happy face, but it's the effect of it that needs to be examined. In terms of the coaches and the teachers, don't press me if I had to choose between 10 coaches in this area and 10 EDDs in education for the education of my children. Don't press me. You can press me. I think the coaches. Because they're not, most of them follow their instincts and their common sense, and they're not complicated by theories. Often, these theories, as Diane's book points out, are wrong. Check Dunbar High School, not the Dunbar of history, which is a wonderful story in itself, but the Dunbar of 4 years ago. There was a story done on Dunbar High School here in the district, which was the worst performing high school in D.C., which you got to work hard to do. And the author compared what was going on in the classroom with what was going on at the basketball team. Basketball team was number 3 in the country. School, you could walk into class anytime. Nobody said anything if you were late or early. You could be prepared or unprepared. No one cared about your homework. You could wear anything you liked. You could talk to the teacher any manner you wanted. Basketball team, you showed up on time or you did not play. You wore your uniform or you did not play. You drilled to the level of expectation or you did not play. You performed, you showed respect for the coach or you did not play. Somebody said, duh, I wonder if any of this is transferable. Well, you're right. It's not exactly the same thing, but lo and behold, some of it is transferable. I'll pass the last question since I've spoken too much. Oh, the federal role. Oh, that whole thing. Yeah, I think there's a federal role in education. Obviously, most of the work needs to be done at the state and local level. What's interesting in this debate between these two candidates is they both see a fairly substantial role for the federal government. So this is the first time we've seen a Republican having that position, and the first time we've seen a Republican with a fairly self-confident view of education. Most of the work, I think we all agree, 90% of the work, 95% of the work has to be done locally, at the school level, the parental level, the home level, and at the state. But there are things for the federal government to do, and there are some nice, nasty questions to be asked, such as some of you take up in your book, national testing, national standards, where you probably would be surprised to find agreement among us. The federal government, I think, does have this responsibility to be sure that civil rights laws are being observed. I think it's a very important part. I had 800 lawyers at the Department of Education when I was there looking into these disputes. The undervalued function of the federal Department of Education, which again my friend Checker and Diane taught me, was to be a reliable indicator of how the country's doing. How are our students doing? How are they doing in comparison to kids from other nations? But how are they doing in comparison to kids from other states and cities? There are also obvious requirements of law, 94-142, special education, and other ways in which federal government can do it.
I'd like to make just one comment on the federal role, and that is it's something that Diane and Bill and I, all three of us, care about, and that is the federal research role that we've lost, in part, I think, because it may have not had enough time. But there needs to be a lot of tough-mindedness in the spending of this money. But we're all talking about the fact that we didn't have hard research the way we do at the National Institutes of Health, where we go out and do clinical trials, and then it's up or down on whether we go forward. We've never put enough money, in my judgment, with enough tough-minded research managers on the education side to do the level of research we need to do. And I'd be interested in Diane's comments, that she was the Assistant Secretary for Education, but I would love to run a federal research budget the way, with the kind of standards and rigor and review that we do at the NIH level.
You may not be surprised to hear this, but given your current job, some of the best education research that's taking place right now is coming from NIH.
Yeah.
Not from the Department of Education. It's been going on for years.
Well, because they invest in longitudinal studies, don't move on them too early, and they're willing to, and they have the resources to do long-term research and to fund people over a long enough period of time, which is what it takes. Now, it also takes an attitude from appropriations committees that are willing to make that investment and have the kind of confidence in the researchers.
And also the tough-mindedness, as you mentioned, to respect the canons of science in terms of having samples and match samples, and not just doing, here's how I feel about it, here's my opinion, and I want, another $10 million to tell you how I feel about it.
Well, and I told Bill, we've closed down a lot of Head Start programs in this country. No one previously had ever closed down Head Start programs. They didn't meet the standards. Diane thinks that they still need more education, more cognitive learning. I absolutely agree with her. But the fact is, we set standards for the programs. They didn't meet the standards, and if they didn't make the corrections we asked for, we closed them down. No one else ever had the nerve to do that. That changes attitudes and behavior of all the programs across the country if they think you're serious. We've done the same thing with fraud and abuse on the healthcare side. And what I've learned out of all of this is if you really want to change institutional behavior, you have to do a full court press. You can't do these little demonstrations around the country. And people have to believe that you're serious. And then the institutions themselves start to change. But you've got to be very clear about what your expectations are. I think that education hasn't had, either the Department of Education hasn't had the kind of resources to do this kind of thing, or the kind of consensus to do it, either from the educational community or the constituencies, or from the Congress itself, which wants faster answers, I think, on all of this.
Bill, you raising your hand to speak?
Thanks, Ron. You made it feel like my house here. All right, anyway, I'm not going to word it. But these are wonderful. I was going to bring up what Donna said. I think, Donna, when you closed down those Head Start places, they knew you were serious. That was a good sign. You were serious. You said, we close them down, and we want people to know we're serious. When you close them down, they know you're serious. It would be interesting to think about the Secretary of Education closing down a school for non-performance. What kind of resources do you need? We read about a school in Baltimore the other day. It was in the newspaper, where not one child is reading at grade level. Not one child is reading at grade level. Now, I'm not sure I want to give the Secretary of Education this kind of power, but note the following, this analogy. Early in the Clinton administration, somebody served up a rotten hamburger in Portland, Oregon, and the Secretary, Secretary got on a plane and went out there, and they closed down this burger joint. They maybe closed down all the burger joints. State, local, federal authorities, these people aren't serving any hamburgers. We find a school district where nobody's getting educated. We go out there, we raise ruckus about it, and what the answer is? Give them more money. Give them more money. Now, I think that's the problem. Now, you may not want to give the Secretary of Education that kind of authority, but let's stay with the main point here, which is, that's right, the Education Department, other departments need the resources to do the hard science, if you will, to do the hard inquiry, and to make those kind of determinations. And then we have to be more courageous at all levels in saying what the consequences should be. You're not doing the right kind of Head Start, you're not doing the right kind of medicine, you're not able to educate one child in your school, you have no right to federal money or anybody else's money.
If you have questions, raise your hand. We have folks with microphones who will come to you, and stand up when you ask your question so the cameras can see you. Identify yourself and keep your questions or your comments brief. Let's start over here.
Ben Wildavsky with U.S. News and World Report. A question for Diane Ravitch. It's a question about unintended consequences. I don't know if this is a history question or a policy question, maybe both, but I wonder if there is a danger that one can start with what seems a very reasonable premise that, all kids should be exposed to the same challenging curriculum. Let's talk about high school and college-bound curriculum, say. But that might degenerate into all kids being exposed to the same curriculum, and that therefore nobody being exposed to the most challenging curriculum and everyone getting the same crummy, watered-down curriculum. And the one example that springs to mind is actually overseas. I'm thinking of the demise of the grammar school system in England. And a lot of people would say that you went from an inequitable system where a lot of kids were shunted off to secondary moderns at age 11, and a minority went to these good grammar schools. But when the grammar schools became comprehensive, then you had a lot of kids getting an education that really wasn't, that nobody was getting as much of the good education that they started with.
I think that's a good question, Ben. I would say, and maybe this is just a rhetorical answer to a good question, that if you expect all children to learn science, if you expect all children to learn history, they're not going to be taking exactly the same courses. They're not going to move at the same pace. And I think that one of the points that I brought out again and again, particularly with reference to people like Kenneth Clark and John Carroll's work at Harvard and Benjamin Bloom at the University of Chicago, was that children do learn at different rates. Some children need more time. But I do think that you can establish goals that are not low minimums. Some children will far exceed those goals. But what would be, and again, this is not a policy book, but it's an argument that we should expect all children to have at least the rudiments of liberal education and not make a decision early on that these are the deserving and these are the undeserving, which has been a large burden in our history. And I would not want to see the kids who are achieving held back. But I think now a lot of those kids are being held back by low expectations.
Yes, sir, right there.
Bruce McGlory from Brookings, and to Donna Shalala, if I may. Donna, you used this phrase, learning takes hard work. Who could disagree? But is it not the case that there's a real tension for the schools, the public schools in particular, between that and dropout rates? If you make it tough, you make it hard, then you're going to have dropout rates increasing. And to come back to the discussion about coaches, coaches, in fact, are starting with teams, and you have to make the team or you're not part of the deal. And they have a threat over the head of not making the team. The high schools don't have that same threat, at least through age 16. You have to keep them in school and keep them grinding. So I think there's a real tension between making things tough, as one should, and dropout rates. And your very comment about closing down Head Start. Head Start is not a legal right, and therefore you can close those down. And maybe, but education, public education is a right, and there's a real tension then.
Well, let me be clear on the Head Start point. When we closed down a program, we started a new program under new leadership, so the kids were not left out in the cold. We made sure a new program was started or the kids were transferred to another program. Diane knows, and Bill knows this literature better than I do, the reason kids drop out is not because school is hard. In the case of boys, it's initially because they don't learn how to read, which means that they fall further and further behind. In the case of girls, for a very long time, it was because they got pregnant. And I think that if kids are learning,
we have a better chance of keeping them in school. If you look at what people have done with dropout rates and with retention in particular, it was individualizing the learning, making sure that the school had an attitude that no one was going to fall behind, that some kids would learn some things slower than other kinds of things. But you guys know the literature. I've been away from this for too long. I'm out of my depth.
I think that, you know, from what I've seen and from what we're seeing in places like Chicago, the biggest cause of dropouts is kids being advanced to a point where they can't possibly succeed, where they get moved into the 9th grade and they can't read. And they begin to feel terrible about themselves because they're so far behind. They become aggressive, angry. That in itself is a cause of dropping out. So I don't think the idea, and I wouldn't want to suggest that the idea is just get tough. I don't think that's the idea at all. I think the idea really is, as Donna said, and she's not that far from the literature, that there has to be a caring for individual children, not to allow them to advance to the 9th grade without being able to read, because if that happens, that means nobody knows who they are. Nobody noticed.
I'm reminded of a young man that came to see me. He was referred by a friend when I was president of Hunter College, and he desperately needed a job because the nonprofit he was working for as a custodian was closing. And she warned me that he was illiterate. And when he came in to see me, I said, "How come you never learned how to read?" And he said, well, it had to do with torn jeans. He had gone to school when he was in the 5th grade and his jeans were torn. His mother was an alcoholic. The principal sent him back to get his jeans fixed. So he went home and he tried to sew them up himself. And he went back to school and she said that wasn't good enough. So he left and he never went back. And what he said to me has haunted me for the rest of my life. He said, "No one noticed." The whole point is that we've got to notice every single one of those kids. He has a job and he learned how to read and we got him into a literacy program and he's still working in Hunter, I think. But the point is that we make sure that each of these kids is noticed, and the point is that it takes work to learn how to read, but working with that child to make sure they learn how to read is the point of the discussion about education here.
One more thing for coaches, if I might, that crosses over, if
Comment on Bobby Knight?
if you will. Yeah, sure. Had to go. You can't do that. Two things. One is Jaime Escalante had more kids going out for calculus than they had going out for basketball. He made calculus a cool thing to do. He also pointed out how it could be valuable to you. But he attached prestige to it. Prestige was attached to it in the school. But see, I think there's something about high expectations. I think kids read high expectations as a way of taking them seriously. Low expectations, indifference, is a way of dismissing them. The coach takes them seriously, maybe cuts them from the team, but looks at their ability and honestly evaluates. Coach isn't going to put somebody on the team who can't play, not going to keep somebody off who can play unless they don't abide by the rules. But some of this, again, I think is transferable. You're right, Bruce. There's a constitutional right to education, but there's no constitutional right to go to that school. That school doesn't have a constitutional right to stand if it's not educating anybody. And I think, again, of Father Clemens. You know, Father Clemens in Chicago with those little dirt poor, inner city Catholic schools. Remember what he said to me? He said, the harder we bear down on academics and character, the longer the application list grows. More people want to get in here because they know this is the way their kids are going to make it. If they have to meet certain standards of character and certain standards of achievement. You make no demands of a child, I think he loses respect for you and the institution you represent.
Quick points in response, Bruce. First of all, there have been schools that have been closed down. They call it reconstituting. Really, really bad schools where kids aren't reading have been closed. The kids have not been denied their right to an education. They've been moved to other schools, hopefully to get a better education. Secondly, the one policy recommendation that I do make in my book is to inveigh against the super large comprehensive high schools that we've created too many of in our society, and to point out that this was not an inevitability or a necessity, and these are the schools where so many children get lost. And then I have to mention, because because my dear friend Mary Butts is here, and in her school, which was a small school for 350 kids, all kids from very poor neighborhoods, 90% non-white kids, they were learning Latin and French and Spanish and history and literature and getting all the good stuff, and most of these kids, 90% of them, coming from very poor homes, going on to college. Many of these kids came in with low to no literacy skills, and they had to be taught to read. But, you know, kids shouldn't get to the 9th grade without someone noticing that they haven't learned to read.
Questions? Yes.
Mal Milliken with Washington Independent Writers. I'm interested in knowing how much failure would you attribute to the philosophy of John Dewey. I see you quote him in 1897 saying that school was the primary means of social reform and the teacher was the prophet of the true God and the usher in of the true kingdom of God. And earlier on you had mentioned the influence of Rousseau on Dewey. You mentioned Emile of Rousseau's writing as Dewey saying that was a reminder that what is learned in school is relatively superficial compared to what is learned in the ordinary course of living. And you write that, like Rousseau, Dewey rejected the rote learning and formalism of the public schools, especially the common belief that what was taught should be disagreeable so as to teach children to exercise their willpower and self-discipline.
I have very mixed feelings about Dewey, and C-SPAN doesn't have time to hear all of my mixed feelings. Well, I would say that he was certainly the most influential philosopher of education, and he had some very good influences in terms of his caring about how children learn and his interest in that children should be motivated and actually enjoy learning, which I certainly would prefer almost all the time. I think that the pernicious effect of that child-centered approach of Rousseau is that when you have a truly child-centered school where the kids kind of learn when they feel like it and don't learn when, and are surrounded by lots of good stuff but don't have to do anything unless they feel like it. And there were, as I say in the book, a number of schools like this, particularly in the private sector and some in the public sector. The kids who suffer are the poor kids because the well-to-do kids have all these advantages at home. They have parents who've been educated. They sit around the dinner table, talk about current events. They get an education-rich literacy background. It's the poor kids who suffer when they don't have teachers. And I do believe in teachers. I believe, and the big divide, this woman named Jean Shull, who wrote a wonderful book that's out recently called The Academic Achievement Challenge, and she died last year. Jean made the difference between the child-centered classroom and the teacher-centered classroom. And in the child-centered class, the evidence is overwhelming that teachers should teach. I don't believe teachers should facilitate. I believe teachers should teach, and that children are the beneficiary when they have teachers who love teaching and are good at it.
My name is Giselle Lundy Ponce. I'm with the American Federation of Teachers, and I'd like to get your opinions. I'd like to get your opinions on the latest standards-based reform, not movement, and what you think it needs to succeed.
I think that it's important to have standards, and given the nature of our federal system of education, the states are the ones that set the standards. Some of them are better standards than others, and I think we are moving in the right direction. There are a lot of glitches. There are a lot of people who don't want any standards. My book is a history, a few hundred pages of the people saying no standards, no test, nothing that's disagreeable, and let just everybody go out on the playing field and wander around instead of having coaches who actually teach them something. I think that there are going to be problems. There'll be some setbacks along the way, but we're moving as a nation in a good direction where we are establishing as a basic premise that children should be expected to learn and teachers should be expected to teach, and this is a good thing, and that we don't want to send kids out into the world who will go to college and be in need of remedial education. It would be ideal if all kids who finished high school could read and write and do mathematics, could know enough science to protect themselves in the world from all kinds of frauds, and know enough history to be good citizens and to be intelligent voters. So I think that would be the ideal. And then if they decide to go to college, they shouldn't have to go into a remedial reading course. But I think we're moving in that direction, and it's going to take a lot of persistence on the part of those of us who really do want all children to learn.
Bill, did you have
Yeah, I'd comment just two examples in the spirit of bipartisanship. One is Texas and what's happened in Texas, the standards movement in Texas. That test created a lot of fear and trembling, but it got a lot of results, tremendous advances. This is the positive version of the negative, which is stated which is described in the book. These standards and high expectations meant tremendous results, particularly for poor and minority kids, black and Latino kids in Texas. People said, well, this wasn't just Governor Bush, this was Ann Richards and Ross Perot, and Governor Bush has been gracious to acknowledge that it was the work of many people. But the work of standards and the agreement that there be standards and on what those standards will be was a very good thing. I'm very excited about what Paul Vallis is doing in Chicago, where he's saying standards will be operational here. And a lot of kids in summer school this summer in Chicago. He's got high expectations throughout the schools. He's serious about charters. He's serious about a lot of things, but it's working, and those kids are learning. But yeah, you can't call it a movement anymore. They won't let you. Just say you're for standards.
No,
you're forgetting the goods to the kids. That's what you're saying.
Let's call it good education.
Good education.
That you understand what you're trying to accomplish, and that if you're not educating kids, that's not it?
Not the good education movement. We can't
Right.
call it.
No, it's not a movement. It's just good education.
Madam Secretary, do you have a comment on standards?
Well, the only thing I would say is that the key to this is that we're not back here, a decade from now looking at the standards business because we haven't learned enough and haven't made adjustments. And so I again would plead for the kind of research and evaluation and the kind of rigor that we need on what we think works now so that we can add and build on it and that we're not just jumping from one good idea to another.
Don't we know? I mean, Diane, don't we know a lot about education? Don't we know what works? I mean, in terms of, I have some sense from the book of what you would suggest to be the
Well, in
curriculum.
fact, Diane has written about a lot of things that work, and we do know a lot of things that work. Whether you, in a large school system at the state level or at the local level, can put all those pieces together, given a variety of different kind of restraints, and then stick with them over a long enough period of time. I think the importance of what Texas and North Carolina, Chicago, some other places have done is they've hung in there for a long enough period of time with the proper resource investments, understanding the importance of teaching and the kind of investments that you have to make in teachers at the same time. And there's been a kind of partnership with the teachers, too, at the same time, who initially resisted but now are more a part of the solution.
Let me just add that it is important, and Bill started off saying this, to stress the bipartisan nature of support for standards, and also to say that part of standards is that you have to have some measure of performance, because when we say, let's do the research and see if a program is working, how are you going to find out if it's working unless you have some way of determining, are kids actually learning more, are more kids reading, are they reading at higher levels? We have to have, we go back to your point, good solid research. We have to maintain the nonpartisan nature of education reform, if at all possible, and continue to see whether we're seeing an improvement in performance based on solid measures.
One or two more questions? Way in the back there, next to the TV.
Yael Chaddick, the Christian Science Monitor. Diane, one of the striking things about your book is how easy it turns out for bad ideas to get into public education. Now, bureaucracies usually take a long time to change at all, yet this is one that seems to change on a dime, adopting really bad ideas. Why is that? And the flip side, how do you get bad ideas out of the system? And one example might be the reports that are coming out on bilingual education in California. A lot of improvement when you get rid of it, and yet those results have met with almost no response from either political candidate or anyone else in public education. Why is that? Help us.
Why do bad ideas get established so easily? Actually, I don't think they get established easily. If you read my book and you know that it took a long time for bad ideas to really change the nature of the teaching force. Teachers didn't really go along. Bill mentioned this. Teachers didn't go along. They resisted. They really did want to keep a certain ideal of the education ladder, keeping it open to all kids and really emphasizing good education for all kids. Teachers.
Wait. Open classroom, values clarification, the new math, these things were out and they were in. And it took a long time to get them out.
But what happened was, and this is the argument of my book, that once you said, we don't do academics. We do all kinds of other things, but the academics that's just for the top 20%. That's not for every. Then all these things start coming through, and it becomes the flavor of the month, the idea of the month, and anybody with a kind of a wonderful, brilliant new innovation, well, why not? Let's try it. So I think that's how when you set aside your central mission and you don't have a central mission, then you're up for grabs, and any kind of religious zealot, political zealot, social zealot feels that the welcome mat is out for you.
Next question, right here. I'm Peter Tautfest. I work for the German newspaper Die Tageszeitung, and I'd like to ask you to put your research into international perspective, if you could. Is the trajectory of reform in this country peculiar to this country, or to phrase my question slightly differently, this is probably not the only country that has instituted a number of reforms. European countries have done the same, some surely misguided, some that few countries would want to part with. Still, in international comparisons, American students seem to be outperformed by other students. Is there another reason why American schools have been failing, other than the rash of reforms that you've written about?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on international education, and I would hesitate to make any proclamation about how other countries are doing. I know that in the Thames study, American students did fairly well in the 4th grade, at the average in the 8th grade, and not terribly well in the final year. And critics have said, well, that's not really valid because kids of all different ages were included in the final year, and our high school seniors were compared in some cases to students in the 2nd year of Technical Institute. I don't know, whether to go with the critics or not on that. I would say that other countries have been affected by some of the same trends that I describe in my book. And other countries, and I think now in particular of the French, have maintained a very fundamental commitment to a very high standard of universal education. So I'm not going to make any international or universal declarations. Bill, do you have anything to add on this, or Donna?
Yeah, two things. One, somewhat facetiously, when I became Secretary of Education, someone said your most important job is to increase American competitiveness vis-a-vis the Japanese. What will you do? I said, I will sell them the education reforms we have put in place over the last 40 years. That'll bring them down, and we'll go back to basics and succeed. Apparently, we had some success in doing that. Actually, it's remarkable. I think one cannot look at the numbers and not conclude that there's a systemic problem. Things get worse as you go along. We get dumber relative to kids in other countries. The longer you go on in American education, the dumber you get compared to kids in other countries in math and science. And that's unforgivable. That's the bad news. The good news is, back to the empirical point, the point that Donna's been hammering, we know a lot about what to do to educate our children. We know how to do certain things. We know certainly how to get them up to par in 3rd and 4th grade, where they score so well. We also know something about the later grades, but we, for some reason, either willfully or ignorantly don't do what we know how to do. It's tougher, of course, as they get into 5th, 6th, 7th grade. Puberty puts obstacles in the way, but puberty is international, as far as I can tell. Other people have found ways to address it. Let's look at the bright side. Let's look at success. What's the name of that report that Heritage put out about the 26? No excuses. Here are 26 schools or school districts with poor kids, previously low expectations, but astounding achievement after the result of somebody going in there and shaking it up. What are the common elements? Some reformer with incredible zeal. We may not need movements, but we need leaders. We need these reformist principles, these possessed women, for the most part, who come in and say, we're going to make this school work. And they take the school by the back of the neck. And what's interesting to me, in terms of curriculum, is they kind of ignore a lot of the curriculum pieces, even some of the Hirsch pieces, which I think are very important, and they focus on math and reading in the first 2 or 3 years. Math and reading, they say the other stuff can come later. And again, we have, I think, enough evidence to be fairly confident that this works. And we have enough evidence of what works in the later grades if we would just do what we know works more consistently.
I think the final point I would make is that the weakness of those who study education is that they don't look at the system as seamless right through higher education. That we do some corrections in higher education. American kids tend to catch up And of course, we're reaching deeper into deeper into the population for higher education. And one of the weaknesses of our discussion on policy for elementary and secondary is that we actually don't look at it right through to higher education to see how we make those corrections in higher education. Most of us have good stories about that. We catch up. The kids that are well prepared have an easy time their first 2 years in college, and the rest of us, you know, really had to scamper to learn the kinds of things we probably should have learned earlier on. And I think that if we really are going to look at this in a fairly rigorous way, we have to look at the corrections in higher education and look at it in a much more seamless way so that we can actually see what this whole enterprise is about.
Madam Secretary, and Bill Bennett, and Diane Ravitch, thank you very much for an interesting and informative discussion. You are all invited to a reception now where I suspect this discussion will continue on a more informal basis. It's upstairs on the second floor of the Stein Room. And the full transcript of this and lots of other information on education issues are available on the Brookings website at www.brookings.edu. Thank you all for coming and participating in this conference.
Author and Brookings Fellow Diane Ravitch will be on Book Notes October 8th to discuss her book, Left Back, A Century of Failed School Reforms. Book Notes.